thundering hooves and rattling sabres. This is the stuff of the Napoleonic Wars, surely, or perhaps even earlier. Something medieval perhaps, knights on horseback, lances drawn, charging the enemy line. For the most part, this is true. By the 20th century, horses were generally reduced to support roles, while frontline cavalry units gave way to mechanized infantry divisions. But not always. There were cavalry charges throughout the First and Second World Wars. And what's more, these were not simply desperate suicide missions. These charges were strategic decisions, leveraging speed and ferocity for maximum effect. Sometimes they even worked, an old school tactic prevailing against the industrialized might of modern defensive strategy. So let's take a look at how these modern cavalry charges work, examining 4 key examples across the 2 world wars. Operation Barbarossa, the Axis invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, had not brought the sweeping successes its commanders had hoped for. The summer offensive turned into an autumn one, and as this autumn gave way to the winter of 1941, the Germans had no option but to fall back. Unprepared, overstretched, and struggling in hostile conditions, the Axis forces retreated, pledging to return stronger and better equipped. That return came the following summer with Fall Blau, or Case Blue. Once again, the roar of tank tracks and artillery bombardments would fill the air of Eastern Europe as a colossal force mobilized and headed eastward. This time, each of the panzer divisions had been reinforced, adding more hardware with a view to smashing the Soviet lines. There were also more foreign soldiers involved in the Axis advance, 27 Romanian divisions, 13 Hungarian, 2 Slovakian, and a volunteer division from neutral Spain. Mussolini also sent 10 Italian divisions to join the fray, up from 3 the previous year. By late August, one of these Italian divisions found itself in difficulty as it advanced between the Don and Kopyo rivers near Volgograd. The Italian infantry division known as the Forzeska was subject to an intense assault from the Soviet 304th Rifle Division. The men of Sforzeska held their line for 2 days, but were eventually routed, giving up valuable ground to the Soviets around the small village of Isbuscenskij. Italian commanders, fearful of embarrassment, sent in a reinforcing regiment to save the day. This was Regiment Savoia Cavalleria. But even the Savoia did not find the going easy. On August 23rd, commanding officer Colonel Alessandro Campetoni Casago ordered his men to halt. They were still 1,000 meters short of their objective, but the failing light drove them to set up camp for the night and continue in the morning. Unbeknownst to the Italians, out there in the darkness, the Soviets were making their own maneuvers. By morning, the Savoia would be surrounded and eliminated if everything went the Soviets' way. At 3:30 AM on August 24th, an Italian recon patrol discovered the Soviet lines. The Russians, without the element of surprise on their side, now had no choice but to open fire. Alessandro, taking fire from multiple directions, ordered his horse-drawn artillery into position to deliver a swift response. But this would not be enough. He summoned Captain De Leon and his second squadron of more than 100 cavalrymen and ordered them to the Soviet left flank. Moving desperately through the dark, De Leon and his men reached the left-hand extreme of the Soviet lines. Here, they drew their sabres, readied their grenades, and charged. Sweeping from left to right across the lines rather than through them, 2nd Squadron shattered the resolve of more than 2,000 riflemen entrenched there. But Colonel Bettoni recognized a weakness in the plan. By leaving Soviet riflemen alive in their foxholes, the advancing cavalry were dangerously exposed from the rear. He ordered in the 4th Squadron, who dismounted and launched their own frontal assault in support of the horsemen. Captain Silvano Abba, leading the 4th, would be cut down in the assault. He would posthumously receive the Gold Medal of Military Valor. Stirred by the success of the cavalry action, Bataan ordered an assault from the 3rd Squadron, bringing the battle to an end 6 hours after it began. Yes, in a sense. The Italian position would have been routed if it wasn't for the cavalry charges, and the actions of the 2nd, 3rd and 4th Squadrons saved the day. But while the Italians did taste victory, it was a costly one. Those who were there talk of horses ripped apart by bullets, some continuing to rush forward even after receiving mortal wounds. Corporal Loli of 2nd Squadron found his sabre jammed in the scabbard and could not draw it. He was felled along with half of his men before they had reached the midway point in the Soviet lines. After such heavy losses, the possibility of further cavalry charges was eliminated. Instead, Alessandro and his men consolidated their position. Meanwhile, the action effectively saved the Sforzetska, who were able to regroup. It wouldn't be long before both units were back on the offensive, an offensive that would take them as far as Stalingrad and the destruction of the Axis campaign in the east. The Savoia itself would be all but wiped out by Soviet forces the following spring. Cavalry charges have traditionally been shock attacks designed to punch a hole through enemy defenses with fast-moving troops or to strike terror into the hearts of opposing soldiers. This was true at Blenheim and Emsdorf in the 18th century and at Waterloo in the beginning of the 19th, and it was still true in the early part of the 20th century. The First World War has become synonymous with industrialized warfare and grim, bloody stalemates, a struggle in which traditional cavalry charges were difficult, if not completely impossible. But this wasn't the case everywhere. There were still theaters in which a cavalry charge could, and did, bring an end to the deadlock. By 1917, as the Third Battle of Ypres opened up on the Western Front, fighting in the Middle East was focused on the Sinai Peninsula and in Palestine. The campaign had already lasted for 2 years, and commanders were concerned that a bloody stalemate would ensue in Palestine, grinding down the forces of both sides. After failing to capture Gaza, Entente forces expanded their scope in October, driving further north into Palestine and setting the ambitious objective of capturing Jerusalem before the end of the year. To do this, they would need to first capture the town of Beersheba, a crucial target on the eastern edge of the Ottoman defensive line. The Entente forces had to take Beersheba quickly and decisively, and without destroying the valuable logistics infrastructure and water wells contained in the town. General Edmund Allenby, who had been stationed in the Middle East since June, gave his approval to a plan to achieve the same. If all went as hoped, Beersheba would fall in just a single day, with all the vital infrastructure still intact. On October 31st, the plan was put into action. The artillery bombardment began just before 6 AM, with field guns and howitzers concentrating their fire on the Ottoman positions. The 60th London Division moved in, launching an assault on Hill 1070 in front of the Ottoman line. The 74th Yemenry also pushed forwards, sustaining significant casualties but taking its objective by lunchtime. The Anzac mounted regiments advanced to Tel Isakati, effectively controlling the road leading out to Hebron. By late in the afternoon, the Ottomans understood that things were not going their way. They had held up the Allied advance, but they could not do so for much longer. They would withdraw from the town, laying the rail and road infrastructure, and crucially the water wells, to waste as they went. The Entente forces would need to act quickly if they were not to lose everything they had fought so hard for. The 4th and 12th Australian Light Horse Regiments were instructed to saddle up. At 4:10, they attacked. The charge began slowly. A walk became a trot as advanced troopers scanned the ground for obstacles and enemy positions. They'd covered more than 4 kilometers before the trot became a gallop, and they still had 2 kilometers left to cover. 2 German aircraft soared into the skies above the Australians. The battle had become horses against planes, but the mounted men proved difficult to hit as they gathered speed. Australian trooper Ion Idris described what he saw. Their 1,000 hooves were stuttering thunder, coming at a rate that frightened a man. They were an awe-inspiring sight, galloping through the red haze, knee to knee and horse to horse. the dying sun glinting on bayonet points. Artillery barrages picked off key gun emplacements, and any Ottoman crews who were still at their weapons panicked, failing to adjust for the speed of the closing advance. Their bullets flew overhead, and the cavalrymen pressed on. Now, the advanced troops were at the trenches, their horses leaping the dugouts and then turning back on the terrified Turkish soldiers. The Australians dismounted and neutralized the trenches with rifle fire before moving on. Ottomans were now surrendering in their droves, but not all were ready to give up the fight. As the leading Australian horsemen assaulted trenches at the rear, they encountered around 60 Ottoman soldiers who were dug in deep and ready to resist. Brutal close quarters fighting brought the light horse regiments their final victory. At around 5 p.m, Entente troops located the Ottoman column, eagerly withdrawing with whatever men and armaments they still had at hand. The entire column surrendered without complaint, and the Battle of Beersheba was all over by 5:30 p.m. Yes, at the Battle of Beersheba, the idea of the cavalry charge was not something antiquated and desperate. Instead, it was an example of a changing form of warfare, a mobile warfare that would avoid stalemates rather than creating them. These mobile concepts would become key to the execution of combat over the coming decades, as sophisticated mechanized divisions made trenches and static linear positions all but obsolete. While the deployment of horses on the front lines was becoming outdated, the dynamic tactics employed by the light Australian horse at Beersheba were not. In terms of the campaign at Sinai and Palestine, the action at Beersheba was a resounding success. Losses amongst the Australian light horse forces were around 70 killed and wounded, while more than 700 Ottomans were captured alone. Capturing the town shifted the balance in favour of the Entente, pushing the Ottomans back into Palestine. There was still fighting to be done, but the battle, and crucially the cavalry charge, gave the Entente a valuable upper hand. We've covered lots of controversial events on this channel, events for which the fog of propaganda and myth-making have obscured the truth. But few are more controversial than the charge at Krojanty. The moment that gallant Polish cavalrymen rallied their horses in a desperate charge against German panzers, laying down their lives rather than submit to Nazi occupation. So let's try to separate facts from fiction. It is true that Polish cavalry charged a German force in the opening actions of World War II. What's not true is, well, almost everything else. As evening began to fall on September 1st, 1939, the Second World War was only a few hours old. Already, Poland was in peril. With German men and armor sweeping across her borders, a nation that had spent centuries battling for survival, or even just for existence, had yet another monumental fight on her hands. At Tuchola Forest in northern Poland, the 18th Pomeranian Uhlans, a cavalry regiment formed in 1919, came across a group of exhausted Germans. The German infantry had spent the day driving eastwards into Poland's interior. While they'd been successful in executing their lightning attack, the advance had taken its toll, and they sought rest in the nearby forest. Colonel Kazimierz Mastalers sensed an opportunity for the Uhlans. At 7 p.m, he ordered Eugeniusz Swiszak to rally his cavalry and attack. 250 men, consisting of Swiszak's 1st Squadron and the regiment's 2nd Squadron, executed a lightning attack on their own, scattering the German infantry at Tuchola Forest in northern Poland. But almost immediately, the victorious Poles found themselves on the back foot. As their enemy fled, German armored vehicles suddenly rolled into view along the road. This is where the roots of myth begin to take hold. It's true that the armored vehicles fired upon the Polish horsemen, inflicting heavy casualties, killing both Commander Swiszak and Colonel Mastalers. It's also true that these vehicles were panzers, but they were not panzer tanks. Instead, they were most likely leichter Panzerspähwagen or schwerer Panzerspähwagen, armored reconnaissance vehicles mounted on wheels, not tracks. Polish cavalrymen did not charge German tanks with their horses on September 1st, 1939, despite what certain books and documents might tell us. The Polish charge at Krojanty certainly won the initial engagement, scattering the infantrymen encountered in the forest clearing. They also succeeded, at least temporarily, in stalling the German advance in the region, giving the Polish commanders time to withdraw the 1st Rifle Battalion and the National Defense Battalion, who were both engaged nearby. The German 20th Motorized Infantry Division were even convinced that there was a much larger Polish force in the area and considered retreating before General Guderian personally ordered them to stand their ground. But the counterattack by German soldiers left 1/3 of the Polish force either dead or wounded. This was a heavy loss that the Poles could ill afford, and it came during a moment of national crisis for the country. The capital, Warsaw, would fall 28 days later, with the last Polish resistance stamped out a week after that. So why was the Charge of Krojanty so controversial? Partly because of the way it has been manipulated and distorted by so-called historians with their own agendas to service. The idea of Polish troops mounted on horses, flashing their sabres and launching a suicidal charge against panzer tanks is a romantic one, but it presents a patronizing view of the Poles and of their resistance. While Poland was ill-prepared for the speed and power of the German onslaught, so were France, the Netherlands, Denmark, and basically all other nations who found themselves in Germany's way in those first years of the war. The Charge at Krojanty came less than a year before the British humiliation at Dunkirk. No one was prepared for the Blitzkrieg, and the Poles resisted bravely and ably. So where did the myth come from? Originally from German propaganda. The Nazi media machine was almost as powerful as the Wehrmacht itself, and even as other pieces of propaganda were shown to be false, this particular slice of myth-making stuck around, partly because a cavalry charge did happen, just not in the way it was presented. Even after the war, Soviet propaganda kept on pushing the myth of swords and saddles against tanks and machine guns. Not to make the Poles appear brave, but to make them appear stupid, outdated, and naive. Winning the Battle of Hill 262 during the invasion of Normandy, being the highest scoring pilot squadrons in the Battle of Britain, helping to crack the Enigma code. Poland made innumerable contributions to the war effort, contributions that are far more deserving of remembrance than any of the propaganda and mythology spread by her enemies. By mid-January 1942, the situation in the Philippines was dire. Attempts to smash the Japanese invading fleet and repel their amphibious landings the previous December had failed, and now the Americans would withdraw to the peninsulas of Bataan. Here, they would stand and fight, but time was running out in the struggle to save the Philippines. The Battle of Bataan began on January 7th, and the Americans and their Filipino allies set up their first defensive position at the neck of the peninsula. This would be the Mabatang and Mauban line, stretching from Abukay to Morong in the northwest of Bataan. On January 15th, the Japanese launched their first assault on the line, which held. The following day, the Japanese moved their force toward Morong in the hope of concentrating enough power to sever the line. The noose was tightening around the neck of Bataan, and the Allies risked being cut off. Edwin Price Ramsey was only 24 years old at the beginning of 1942. He'd only joined the 26th Cavalry, the Philippine Scouts, because he loved the sport of polo. The 26th had an excellent polo club, he was told, so in June 1941, that's where he decided to serve. Now, on January 16th, 1942, Lieutenant Ramsey was in the thick of the action. As a platoon leader in the 26th Cavalry, he was tasked with leading his unit into Morong, now taken by the Japanese. If a genuine counterattack was to come, Morong had to be in Allied hands. As Ramsey and his men approached the village, they found it deserted. Creeping through the streets in small squads, the American and Filipino troops of the 26th penetrated the eerie silence before converging on the village's center. Gunfire erupted upon the scouts. An advanced Japanese unit had crossed the bridge and entered the village. Beyond them, Ramsey and his men could see a huge Japanese force beginning to ford the river. Indecision would be fatal, while a retreat could put the counterattack in jeopardy. At a moment's notice, he drew his pistol and yelled, "Charge!" The American and Filipino troops suffered only 3 casualties, none of them fatal. Their shock action drove the Japanese back across the bridge and prevented the main force from reaching the village. As American reinforcements arrived, the Japanese began to retreat. Ramsey's quick thinking and the astonishing gallantry of his men had won the day. The last charge, as it became known, did indeed work. Morong was in Allied hands and the counterattack could continue. Unfortunately, this counterattack would itself fail as Japanese troops poured onto the Philippine archipelago. Bataan would fall on April 9th, and Allied prisoners would be subjected to the brutality of the Bataan Death March. Thousands would perish out there on the road. Ramsay and his men fought on as Bataan was squeezed by the invading imperial forces. By March, they were out of food. With heavy hearts, Ramsay himself was reported to be in tears. The 26th Cavalry shot the horses that had performed so bravely at Morong 2 months earlier. The Philippines would fall to the Japanese in early May. October 21st, 2001, Afghanistan. A combined force of American Green Berets and Northern Alliance troops are closing on a Taliban position at Bishkek. Between them and their target is a vast plain, bisected with ridgelines that make advancing difficult. As American planes begin laying down their covering barrage, there's only one option. The cry goes up: charge. Once again, at the dawn of the 21st century, men and horses propel themselves into combat together. Of course, this is a rare sight in modern warfare. Mobile vehicles equipped with armor and firearms of their own have largely made combat-ready warhorses obsolete. However, when the conditions are right, the age-old partnership of man and beast may still have a role to play in modern campaigns. They called Ramsay's charge in Bataan the last. This turned out not to be the case. But what do you think? Which of these cavalry charges was the most important in the context of their campaign? Is there a cavalry action we may have missed? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.